On the morning of January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery lay strapped to a gurney inside the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. At exactly 1:31 a.m., the federal government carried out her execution by lethal injection. She was 52 years old, making her the first woman executed by the federal system in 68 years. Her crime had shocked the nation 17 years earlier. On December 16, 2004, Montgomery drove from Kansas to Missouri, where she strangled a pregnant woman named Zat and cut her unborn baby from her womb. The infant survived. The mother did not. Montgomery then tried to pass the child off as her own newborn daughter. At first, the crime seemed like the act of a cold-blooded killer, a calculated murder driven by an inexplicable desire to steal someone else's baby. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something far more complex. This wasn't just murder. The search for answers would reveal one of the most disturbing cases of abuse ever documented in American legal history. Her trial, her years on death row, and her final hours would divide the nation. Her execution wasn't just controversial, it was unprecedented. What she chose for her last meal and the words she spoke before her death weren't just routine, they were revealing. You'll hear them, and when you do, they'll mean something far deeper. But to understand why the federal government pursued this woman so relentlessly, why they insisted on the ultimate punishment despite overwhelming evidence of her psychological destruction, we have to go back. Back to a trailer in Oklahoma, where unspeakable horrors occurred daily. Back to a little girl whose first words were, "Don't spank me, it hurts." Back to the very beginning of Lisa Marie Montgomery. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences, and the darkest corners of human decision. Hit the like button, tap the notification bell, and stay with us as we uncover the twisted path that led Lisa Marie Montgomery to death row. In December 16, 2004, Becky Harper's hands trembled as she dialed 911 at 3:30 p.m. Her voice cracked as she told the dispatcher about her daughter Bobby Jo Stinnett, 8 months pregnant, lying on the floor of her Skidmore, Missouri home. It looks like her stomach had exploded. Harper sobbed into the phone. Paramedics rushed to the small house on Elm Street, but nothing could prepare them for what they found. 23-year-old Bobby Jo lay in a pool of blood, a jagged gash across her abdomen exposing her internal organs. Her unborn baby was gone, cut from her womb with surgical precision that spoke of desperate intent rather than medical knowledge. Skidmore, a town of barely 300 people in northwest Missouri, had seen violence before. The 1981 unsolved murder of Ken Rex McElroy had put the community on the map for all the wrong reasons. But this crime was different. This was personal, calculated, and unthinkable. Sheriff Randy Strong arrived at the scene and immediately noticed something crucial. No signs of forced entry. The front door was unlocked. Bobby Jo had known her killer well enough to let them inside. This wasn't a random attack. Someone had specifically targeted a pregnant woman for her unborn child. The FBI joined the investigation within hours. An Amber Alert was issued, though it took intervention from Congressman Sam Graves to activate it since the system had never been used for an unborn child before. The alert described a missing newborn, but investigators knew they were racing against time. As word spread through Skidmore, neighbors gathered in stunned silence. Bobby Jo had been a fixture in the community since graduating from Nodaway Holt High School in 2000. She and her husband Zeb ran a dog breeding business from their home, specializing in rat terriers. They had been married just over a year and were eagerly awaiting their first child, due in just weeks. The crime scene told a story of struggle and determination. Blood found between Bobby Jo's toes indicated she had stood during the attack, fighting desperately for her life and her babies. The autopsy would later reveal she had been strangled unconscious, but regained consciousness when the knife cut into her abdomen. Her final moments were spent trying to protect the child she would never hold. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, finding one witness who reported seeing an unfamiliar dirty red subcompact car parked near the Stinnett home earlier that day. The vehicle had never been in the area before, making it stand out in the small community where everyone knew their neighbors' cars. Within hours, investigators began tracing Bobby Joe's recent activities. They discovered she had been active in online dog breeding forums, particularly one called Rat or Chatter, where rat terrier enthusiasts shared breeding tips and arranged sales. Her last known communication had been with someone interested in purchasing a puppy. The digital trail would prove crucial, but as December 16th turned into December 17th, one question haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Where was the baby? And was the child still alive? Skidmore, Missouri woke up on December 17, 2004, to a media circus unlike anything the tiny farming community had ever experienced. News vans lined the streets as reporters descended on the town of 300 residents, all searching for answers about Bobby Joe Stinnett's murder and her missing baby. The Nottoway County Sheriff's Department had never handled a case of this magnitude. Sheriff Randy Strong found himself coordinating with the FBI, Missouri State Highway Patrol, and investigators from multiple agencies as the search for the missing infant intensified. Every moment counted in what everyone hoped would be a rescue mission rather than a recovery operation. Bobby Joe's husband Zeb Stinnett was the first person investigators needed to clear. He had been at work at Kawasaki Motors in Maryville when the attack occurred, providing him with an ironclad alibi. Devastated and in shock, Zeb cooperated fully with authorities while grappling with the unimaginable loss of both his wife and unborn daughter. The couple's story was heartbreaking in its normalcy. They had met through their shared love of dogs and married in spring 2003 at the Skidmore Christian Church. Bobby Joe worked at an engine factory in nearby Maryville while building their dog breeding business from home. She was known throughout the community as cheerful, hardworking, and excited about becoming a mother. Friends described her as someone who lit up any room she entered. High school classmate Gina Baumley remembered her as one of the sweetest people you'd ever meet. The couple had been trying to conceive for over a year before Bobby Joe became pregnant, making the timing of her murder even more cruel. The dog breeding community was tight-knit, both locally and online. Investigators quickly focused on the Rat or Chatter forum where Bobby Joe had been active. The website brought together rat terrier enthusiasts from across the Midwest, allowing them to share breeding techniques, arrange stud services, and sell puppies. It was through this forum that Bobby Joe had met many of her customers. Computer forensics specialists began analyzing the forum's communications, looking for anyone who had recently contacted Bobby Joe about purchasing a dog. They discovered she had been corresponding with someone using the name Darlene Fisher, who had expressed interest in buying a rat terrier puppy. The communications showed this person had claimed to be pregnant as well, with the two women bonding over their shared experiences. The IP address associated with Darlene Fisher traced to Kansas, about 170 miles from Skidmore. FBI agents immediately began coordinating with Kansas law enforcement to track down this potential witness, who might have been the last person to communicate with Bobby Joe before her death. Meanwhile, the Amber Alert had generated hundreds of tips from across the region. People reported suspicious vehicles, strange behavior, and anything that might be connected to the missing baby. Each lead had to be investigated, stretching law enforcement resources thin as they worked around the clock. Darlene had joined the Rat or Chatter forum and quickly established herself as a fellow rat terrier enthusiast. She claimed to live in Fairfax, Missouri, a small town about 30 miles from Skidmore, making her appear to be a legitimate local buyer interested in purchasing a puppy from Bobby Joe's upcoming litter. But investigators noticed inconsistencies in Darlene's posts. Her claimed pregnancy timeline didn't match previous statements she had made in the forum. More importantly, when agents checked with Fairfax authorities, no one by that name lived in the town. The address provided was fictitious. The IP address, however, was very real. It traced back to 32419 South Adams Road in Melbourne, Kansas, a small farming community about 170 miles southwest of Skidmore. The address belonged to Lisa Marie Montgomery, a 36-year-old woman who lived there with her husband Kevin and her 2 teenage sons from a previous marriage. As agents dug deeper into Lisa's online presence, they discovered she had been active in dog breeding circles for years. She attended dog shows throughout the region and had even met Bobby Joe in person at several events. This wasn't a random victim selection. Lisa had known exactly who she was targeting. The communications between the two women revealed a disturbing pattern. Lisa had consistently claimed to be pregnant throughout their conversations, sharing details about her supposed pregnancy progress and due date. She had convinced Bobby Joe that they were experiencing pregnancy journeys together, creating a false sense of connection and trust. On December 15th, the day before the murder, Darlene Fisher had contacted Bobby Joe about purchasing a rat terrier puppy. They arranged to meet on December 16th, with Darlene saying she would drive down from Fairfax to look at the available dogs. The meeting was set for Thursday afternoon, when Zeb would be at work and Bobby Joe would be alone. Investigators realized this was when Lisa Montgomery had switched from deception to action. Cell phone records showed she had driven from Kansas to Missouri on December 16th, a journey that would have taken approximately 3 hours each way. She had packed carefully for this trip, bringing items that suggested she knew exactly what she intended to do. What chilled investigators most was the premeditation evident in Lisa's preparations. She had brought baby supplies, an umbilical cord clamp, and other items needed to care for a newborn. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was a carefully planned abduction that required killing the mother to steal her child. As FBI agents prepared to travel to Kansas to interview Lisa Montgomery, they had no idea they were about to encounter one of the most psychologically damaged individuals they had ever investigated. On the morning of December 17, 2004, FBI agents and local law enforcement surrounded the modest farmhouse at 32419 South Adams Road in Melbourne, Kansas. What they discovered there would both solve the case and reveal the beginning of a much darker story about the woman who had committed this unthinkable crime. Kathy Sage, owner of the Whistle Top Cafe in Melbourne, had served breakfast that morning to Lisa Montgomery, her husband Kevin, their 2 teenage sons, and a newborn baby. Lisa had been showing off the infant to other customers, proudly announcing that she had given birth the day before. She had named the baby Abigail, she said, because it was a biblical name. When agents arrived at the Montgomery residence around 1 p.m., they observed a dirty red subcompact car in the driveway, matching the description from the Skidmore witness. Through the windows, they could see Lisa Montgomery sitting on the living room couch, holding a baby wrapped in blankets. Sheriff Randy Strong and FBI Special Agent Kurt Lipanovich approached the house with extreme caution. They had no idea what mental state Lisa might be in or whether she would harm the infant if cornered. The baby's welfare was their primary concern as they knocked on the door and identified themselves as law enforcement officers investigating an Amber Alert. Kevin Montgomery answered the door and invited them inside, completely unaware of what his wife had done. He genuinely believed Lisa had given birth to their child the previous day. When questioned, he explained that Lisa had called him from Topeka, Kansas, saying she had gone into labor while shopping and delivered the baby at a women's clinic there. Lisa initially stuck to this story when questioned by investigators. She appeared calm and cooperative, even allowing Agent Lipanovich to hold the baby while they talked. But when agents discreetly called the Topeka clinic she had mentioned, they discovered no births had occurred there on December 16th. Confronted with this contradiction, Lisa's story began to change. She now claimed she had given birth at home with the help of 3 friends who were present during the delivery. When asked for their names, she said they hadn't actually been at the house but were available by phone in case she needed help. As investigators continued to press her, Lisa's carefully constructed lies began to unravel. Her stories became increasingly incoherent as she struggled to maintain the fiction that had consumed her life for months. Finally, boxed into a corner with no way out, she broke down and confessed. "The baby is Bobby Joe's," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The confession sent shockwaves through everyone present. Kevin Montgomery was devastated, realizing that the woman he had married and the pregnancy he had celebrated were both elaborate deceptions. The teenage boys were confused and frightened, unable to understand how their mother could have done something so horrific. DNA testing would later confirm what Lisa had admitted. The baby girl was indeed Bobby Joe Stinnett's daughter. Medical examination revealed the infant was healthy despite the traumatic circumstances of her birth. She was immediately taken into protective custody and would soon be reunited with her father Zeb and the extended Stinnett family. Lisa Montgomery was arrested without incident and charged with kidnapping, resulting in death, a federal crime due to the interstate nature of the offense. As she was led away in handcuffs, neighbors gathered to watch in stunned disbelief. They had known Lisa as a quiet woman who kept to herself, never imagining the violence she was capable of. The baby, who would eventually be named Victoria Jo Stinnett, had survived one of the most brutal crimes in American history. But as investigators began to dig into Lisa Montgomery's background, they would discover that this case was far more complex than a simple kidnapping and murder. Lisa Marie Montgomery was born on February 27, 1968, in a small town in Washington state, but her earliest years were spent in chaos that would shape the rest of her life. From the moment she drew her first breath, Lisa was failed by the very people who should have protected her most. Her mother, Judy Shaughnessy, was an alcoholic who drank heavily throughout her pregnancy. This caused Lisa to be born with permanent brain damage, a condition that would affect her cognitive development and emotional regulation for her entire life. Medical experts would later describe this as organic brain damage that fundamentally altered how Lisa's mind processed trauma and stress. Lisa's first recorded words, according to her mother's later testimony, were, "Don't spank me, it hurts." This heartbreaking detail revealed a child who learned fear before she learned love, who understood pain before she understood comfort. At 18 months old, Lisa was already living in an environment where violence was normalized and protection was absent. Her biological father, John Patterson, was also an alcoholic whose relationship with Judy was marked by volatility and dysfunction. When Lisa was still very young, her parents separated, leaving her in an unstable situation that would only get worse. Judy eventually remarried a man named Jack Kleiner, setting the stage for horrors that would define Lisa's childhood. Lisa's half-sister Diane Mattingly, who was older, remembered living on eggshells in their household. The children never knew when violence might erupt or what might trigger their mother's rage. Diane described feeling like she was never good enough and constantly walking in fear of punishment. When Lisa was 8 years old, Diane was removed from the home and placed in foster care. Lisa begged to go with her sister, who was her closest companion and protector, but social services left her behind. This separation devastated Lisa, who lost the one person who had shown her any kindness or stability. The family moved frequently during Lisa's childhood, sometimes as many as 16 times according to court records. This constant upheaval meant Lisa never had the chance to form stable relationships or find consistent adult support outside her home. Each move isolated her further from potential help. School officials noticed troubling signs early in Lisa's education. She often appeared unkempt, wearing dirty clothes that were too big for her and had holes in them. Teachers observed that she would space out frequently, staring into the distance, as if her mind had gone somewhere else. Her grades began to decline, and she was eventually placed in special education classes. Friends and classmates could tell Lisa's family was poor, even in a community where most people struggled financially. She wore hand-me-down clothes and couldn't always wash them regularly. More concerning were the signs of emotional distress that became increasingly apparent as she grew older. When Lisa Montgomery was 11, her stepfather, Jack Kleiner, began sexually assaulting her. transforming their trailer home into a house of horrors that would define the rest of her childhood. What happened to Lisa during these formative years constituted torture by any reasonable definition, yet no one intervened to save her. Jack Kleiner was a violent alcoholic who saw Lisa as his property to abuse however he chose. He built a separate room onto their trailer, accessible only from outside, where he could assault Lisa without being interrupted. He told her he was teaching her how to be a good wife, turning sexual violence into a twisted form of education that warped her understanding of relationships forever. The assaults were brutal and systematic. Kleiner would rape and sodomize Lisa until she bled, often bringing friends over to participate in gang rapes that could last for hours. When Lisa didn't perform to their satisfaction, they would beat her and sometimes urinate on her afterward. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a regular pattern of torture that continued for years. Lisa's mother, Judy, not only knew about the abuse but actively participated in it. She began prostituting Lisa to men who came to their trailer, including servicemen she hired to build a new living room. Judy literally sold her daughter's body to pay for home improvements, calling it a family secret and threatening Lisa if she ever spoke about it. The psychological impact on Lisa was devastating. She began to dissociate during the assaults, mentally removing herself from the situation as a survival mechanism. This coping strategy would become so ingrained that Lisa would struggle with reality distortion for the rest of her life, unable to distinguish between what was real and what her traumatized mind created to protect her. Lisa tried to seek help multiple times, but each attempt was met with disbelief or betrayal. She confided in a cousin who was a police officer, hoping he would rescue her from the nightmare. Instead, he did nothing, later testifying that he simply didn't believe her stories. When she ran to police to report being gang raped, officers returned her to her mother, who facilitated the very assaults Lisa was trying to escape. The isolation was as damaging as the physical abuse. Lisa had no safe adults in her life, no place to turn for protection, and no reason to believe anyone would help her. She learned that speaking up brought punishment rather than rescue, teaching her to suffer in silence and distrust authority figures who should have protected her. School became Lisa's only refuge, but even there she couldn't escape the trauma. Teachers noticed she was increasingly withdrawn and dirty, often appearing to be in a daze. Her academic performance plummeted as her mind struggled to focus on learning while processing ongoing trauma. Yet despite these obvious signs of abuse, school officials failed to take meaningful action. When Lisa was 14, her mother discovered the extent of Jack's abuse and reacted by threatening Lisa with a gun, blaming her daughter for seducing her husband. This response taught Lisa that even when adults acknowledged the abuse, she was the one who would be held responsible for it. Medical experts would later explain that the abuse Lisa endured qualified as torture under international definitions. The systematic nature of the violence, combined with psychological manipulation and isolation, constituted war crimes when committed against prisoners. Yet it was happening to a child in America, with multiple adults participating or enabling it. The trauma wasn't just psychological. It was literally changing Lisa's brain structure. Prolonged exposure to extreme stress during childhood development altered the areas responsible for memory, emotion regulation, and decision-making. These changes would affect every aspect of Lisa's life, making it impossible for her to function normally, even decades later. By the time Lisa reached her mid-teens, the damage was extensive and largely irreversible. She had been systematically broken by people who should have loved and protected her, creating a fractured personality that would struggle with reality for the rest of her life. At 18 years old, Lisa Montgomery married her stepbrother Carl Bowman in August 1986, viewing marriage as her only escape from the torture she had endured throughout her childhood. But what she thought would be freedom from abuse became a continuation of the same patterns of violence and control that had defined her entire life. Carl Bowman was the son of Judy's fourth husband, making him Lisa's stepbrother through their parents' marriage. He was 25 when he married the teenage Lisa, 7 years older and fully aware of her vulnerability and desperation to escape her family situation. Rather than offering protection, he saw an opportunity to exploit someone who had been conditioned to accept abuse as normal. The marriage began Lisa's adult life, but she had never been allowed to develop normally during childhood. At 18, she had the legal status of an adult, but the emotional development of a much younger person. Years of trauma had stunted her psychological growth, leaving her unable to form healthy relationships or make sound decisions about her own welfare. Lisa became pregnant almost immediately after marriage, giving birth to her first child in January 1987. Between 1987 and 1990, she had 4 children in rapid succession while struggling with her own unresolved trauma and mental health issues. Each pregnancy represented both hope for a fresh start and additional stress on her fragile psychological state. Carl continued the cycle of abuse that Lisa had experienced throughout childhood. He was physically and sexually violent, treating her more like property than a partner. The domestic violence was witnessed by their children, who grew up seeing their father's aggression toward their mother as normal family behavior. After the birth of her 4th child in 1990, Lisa underwent a tubal ligation procedure that would prevent future pregnancies. Later testimony revealed this sterilization was forced upon her by both Carl and her mother Judy, who wanted to ensure she couldn't have more children. The procedure was presented as medically necessary, but Lisa felt it was another way to control her body and future. The forced sterilization had profound psychological implications for Lisa. Motherhood had become central to her identity and sense of worth. Being able to bear children made her feel valuable and needed. When that ability was taken away against her will, it created a psychological wound that would fester for years. Lisa's mental health deteriorated significantly during her marriage to Carl. She experienced episodes of mania and depression that would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. Her dissociative episodes became more frequent and severe, sometimes lasting for days, as her mind retreated from reality to protect itself from ongoing trauma. The couple lived in poverty, moving frequently as Carl struggled to maintain employment and Lisa battled her mental health issues. Lisa began claiming to be pregnant again after her tubal ligation, telling Carl and others that she was expecting another child despite the medical impossibility. These false pregnancy claims became a pattern that would continue for years, representing her desperate desire to regain the sense of purpose and value that motherhood had provided. The marriage to Carl lasted until 1998. Over a decade of continued abuse and dysfunction that further damaged Lisa's already fragmented psyche. When they finally divorced, Lisa was a 30-year-old woman with 4 children, severe mental illness, and no healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with trauma or stress. Carl would later use Lisa's false pregnancy claims against her in custody battles, threatening to expose her deceptions to win custody of their children. This threat created additional psychological pressure that would eventually contribute to the desperate actions Lisa would take in December 2004. After her divorce from Carl Bowman in 1998, Lisa Montgomery met Kevin Montgomery, a divorced man who seemed to offer the stability and acceptance she had craved her entire life. But by the time she entered the second marriage in 2000, Lisa's grip on reality had become so tenuous that she built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies about pregnancy and childbirth. Kevin Montgomery was a kind, trusting man who worked in construction and lived in the small farming community of Melbourne, Kansas. When he met Lisa, he was drawn to her gentle nature with animals and her apparent desire for a quiet family life. He had no idea that the woman he was falling in love with was living in an elaborate fantasy world created to cope with decades of trauma. Before they married, Lisa told Kevin she was pregnant and planning to have an abortion. This was the first of many pregnancy-related lies she would tell him, each one designed to test his reaction and gauge his desire for children. When Kevin expressed sadness about the supposed abortion, Lisa knew she had found someone who would value her ability to bear children. Throughout their courtship and early marriage, Lisa continued to claim false pregnancies. She would tell Kevin she was expecting, go through the motions of pregnancy for months, then claim to have miscarried or that she had donated the baby's body to science. Each false pregnancy allowed her to feel valuable and loved, while avoiding the reality that she could no longer conceive. Kevin genuinely believed these stories because Lisa had become expert at deception. She would wear maternity clothes, alter her appearance to look pregnant, and create elaborate narratives about doctor visits and pregnancy symptoms. Her dissociative disorder made these fantasies feel real to her, blurring the line between conscious deception and psychological delusion. The false pregnancies weren't just lies told to others. They were psychological coping mechanisms that allowed Lisa to maintain her sense of identity and purpose. In her traumatized mind, being pregnant meant being valuable, needed, and loved. It was the one role in which she had felt successful during her first marriage, so she desperately tried to recreate that feeling. Mental health experts would later explain that Lisa's false pregnancy claims represented a condition called pseudocyesis, where a person genuinely believes they are pregnant and may even experience physical symptoms. This wasn't simple deception, but a manifestation of severe psychological illness rooted in her traumatic history. By 2004, Lisa's mental state had deteriorated significantly. She was experiencing more frequent dissociative episodes, memory problems, and difficulty distinguishing between reality and fantasy. Her claims of pregnancy had become more elaborate and persistent, creating increasing pressure to produce evidence of the children she claimed to be carrying. The custody battle with Carl Bowman added another layer of desperation to Lisa's situation. Carl knew about her false pregnancies from their marriage and threatened to expose her deceptions to Kevin and use them against her in court. This threat represented a catastrophic loss of the identity and relationship Lisa had built through her lies. In the months leading up to December 2004, Lisa had been claiming to be pregnant with a due date in late December. This pregnancy was supposed to save her marriage, win her custody battle, and restore her sense of purpose. When it became clear she couldn't maintain the lie much longer, her fractured mind began searching for a solution that would make her fantasy become reality. The psychological pressure of maintaining these elaborate deceptions while battling severe mental illness created a perfect storm that would eventually drive Lisa to commit an unthinkable act of violence. Lisa Montgomery's federal trial began in October 2007, nearly 3 years after the brutal murder of Bobby Joe Stinnett. The proceedings would reveal not only the horrific details of the crime, but also the equally disturbing story of Lisa's lifetime of abuse and mental illness that had led to this tragic moment. Federal prosecutors presented a straightforward case focused on Lisa's premeditation and the calculated nature of her crime. They detailed how she had researched Bobby Joe online, planned the meeting under false pretenses, and brought weapons and baby supplies to Missouri. The evidence of planning was overwhelming, from the fake identity she had created to the umbilical cord clamp she had packed. The prosecution dismissed Lisa's history of abuse as the abuse excuse, arguing that millions of people suffer trauma without committing murder. They painted her as a manipulative woman who had made a cold-blooded decision to kill an innocent mother and steal her baby. They highlighted her lies about pregnancy and her ability to deceive her husband as evidence of her calculating nature. Lisa's defense team, led by Frederick Duchart, faced an enormous challenge. They had originally planned to argue that Lisa's brother had committed the murder and given her the baby. But this strategy collapsed when the brother provided an alibi. Just 1 week before trial, they switched to an insanity defense based on mental illness. The defense presented evidence of Lisa's severe psychological problems, including bipolar disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and dissociative disorder. They brought in experts who testified about the impact of childhood trauma on brain development and decision-making abilities. They argued that Lisa was psychotic at the time of the crime and unable to distinguish right from wrong. However, the defense was handicapped by inadequate preparation and investigation. Duchart had not worked with a mitigation specialist as recommended by the American Bar Association for capital cases. This meant he failed to uncover the full extent of Lisa's childhood abuse and trauma, which would have provided crucial context for understanding her mental state. Lisa's mother, Judy Shaughnessy, testified about catching her husband, Jack Kleiner, raping Lisa, but she admitted she never reported it to police. Other family members described the systematic abuse Lisa had endured throughout childhood, though much of the worst abuse wasn't presented to the jury due to inadequate investigation. The prosecution successfully argued that Lisa was competent to stand trial and legally responsible for her actions. They acknowledged her mental health issues but maintained that she knew right from wrong when she drove to Missouri and killed Bobby Joe Stinnett. The jury was instructed that mental illness alone was not a defense against criminal charges. Bobby Joe's family members testified about their devastating loss and the impact of the crime on their lives. Zeb Stinnett spoke about losing his wife and nearly losing his daughter, describing the pain of raising Victoria Joe without her mother. Their testimony was heartbreaking and reminded everyone of the human cost of Lisa's actions. The jury deliberated for several days before reaching their verdict. On October 22, 2007, they found Lisa Montgomery guilty of kidnapping resulting in death. The same jury then unanimously recommended the death penalty, making Lisa the first woman sentenced to death in federal court since the 1950s. Judge Gary Fenner sentenced Lisa to death, noting the brutality of her crime and the impact on the victim's family. The sentence meant Lisa would become the only woman on federal death row, beginning a legal odyssey that would last more than 13 years as her attorneys appealed the conviction and sentence. The trial had exposed the basic facts of the case, but failed to fully explore the complex factors where life. Following her conviction and death sentence in 2007, Lisa Montgomery began the lengthy appeals process that would consume the next 13 years of her life. Her case became a focal point for debates about mental illness, childhood trauma, and the death penalty, attracting attention from legal experts, mental health advocates, and human rights organizations worldwide. Lisa's new legal team, led by attorneys Kelly Henry and Amy Harwell, immediately began investigating aspects of her case that had been overlooked during the original trial. What they discovered was shocking, even to experienced capital defense lawyers. A level of childhood abuse and trauma that had been barely scratched during the original proceedings. The post-conviction investigation involved interviewing nearly 450 people, including family members, neighbors, teachers, social workers, and others who had known Lisa throughout her life. These interviews revealed a pattern of systematic torture and abuse that qualified as some of the worst childhood trauma ever documented in a capital case. Mental health experts who examined Lisa during the appeals process diagnosed her with multiple severe conditions, including bipolar disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder, and brain damage caused by fetal alcohol exposure. They determined that her crime was committed during a psychotic episode triggered by the threat of exposure of her false pregnancies. The appeals revealed that Lisa's original defense attorney had provided ineffective assistance of counsel by failing to adequately investigate her background or present mitigating evidence to the jury. The American Bar Association guidelines require capital defense teams to work with mitigation specialists, but this had not occurred in Lisa's case. The appeals process also revealed the failure of multiple systems to protect Lisa during her childhood. School officials had suspected abuse but failed to report it. Law enforcement had returned her to her abusers when she sought help. Social services had removed her sister, but left Lisa behind. Each failure had contributed to the tragedy that eventually unfolded. In 2020, as the Trump administration resumed federal executions after a 17-year hiatus, Lisa's case gained international attention. over 1,000 advocates signed letters urging President Trump to commute her death sentence to life imprisonment, pointing to her severe mental illness and history of abuse. The coalition supporting clemency included 41 current and former prosecutors, 800 organizations working to combat violence against women, 100 anti-trafficking organizations, and major mental health advocacy groups. They argued that executing someone with Lisa's level of mental illness and trauma history would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Lisa's execution was originally scheduled for December 8, 2020, but was delayed when her attorneys contracted COVID-19 during prison visits. A federal judge granted a temporary stay to allow her legal team to recover and complete her clemency petition, which they filed on December 24, 2020. The clemency petition was nearly 7,000 pages long and detailed the full scope of Lisa's traumatic history for the first time. It included evidence of the brain damage caused by her mother's drinking during pregnancy, the systematic sexual abuse and trafficking she had endured, and the multiple failures of systems that should have protected her. International human rights organizations, including the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, called on the United States to halt Lisa's execution. They cited her severe mental illness and the international prohibition against executing individuals who are seriously mentally ill. Despite these appeals, President Trump declined to grant clemency. Lisa's execution was rescheduled for January 12, 2021, just days before he left office. The decision to proceed with the execution, despite overwhelming evidence of mental illness and a lifetime of abuse, sparked. January 13, 2021, marked the end of Lisa Montgomery's troubled life, as she became the first woman executed by the federal government in 68 years. Her death at 1:31 a.m. in the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, closed a chapter on one of the most controversial capital cases in modern American history. In her final days, Lisa was held under harsh conditions that advocates described as torture. She was stripped of her belongings, placed in a cell with 24-hour bright lighting, and subjected to constant surveillance by guards, including male guards who watched her use the bathroom. These conditions were reminiscent of the powerlessness and violation she had experienced throughout her childhood. Gina Baumley, a childhood friend of Bobby Joe's, told reporters she was hoping for closure and peace with Lisa's execution. She expressed frustration with the focus on Lisa's mental health, arguing that many people experience trauma without committing violent crimes. Lisa's execution took place using lethal injection, the method prescribed for federal executions. She was pronounced dead at 1:31 a.m., becoming the 11th person executed by the federal government since July 2020, when the Trump administration resumed federal executions after a 17-year hiatus. What she chose for her last meal remains undocumented, but her final words were brief and telling. When asked if she had any last words, Lisa Montgomery replied simply, "No." These words, or lack thereof, reflected perhaps a woman who had finally reached the end of a lifetime of pain, with nothing left to say. Subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime documentaries that explore the complex human stories behind the headlines. Like this video if you found it informative and thought-provoking. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Lisa Montgomery's mental illness and traumatic history should have spared her from execution? How can we better protect children from abuse? Share this documentary with others who need to understand the real-world impact of childhood trauma and mental illness.